a consideration of the natural hazards chapter, but we agreed last time that we would start with a presentation on natural hazards. We've had the ability to do that for ourselves, and now we want to have it essentially online so that people can see the presentation that we've had to fully appreciate the process that we're going through. So I'll just quickly, before we start that, I'll just quickly run through the order of play. So we're going to do the Stage 2 natural hazards, which is coastal erosion, coastal inundation, high hazard flooding areas first. That will be followed by the natural and cultural heritage chapter, the coastal environment chapter held over from Stage 2, the central city, the specific purpose zone flatland recovery, which is the residential red zone and quote marks, Cranford Basin provisions to be included into the residential chapter, and then some minor changes that were notified in Stage 2 but need to be amended to allow consideration of Stage 3 matters as a package, and some of the special purpose zones are in that particular grouping as well. So that's the order of play for today, and I just want to make a quick comment, particularly in light of the headline in the press this morning, and then we'll go straight into the presentation. Did you?
I just wanted to know whether we would be voting on individual chapters as we dealt with them, or are we doing the whole lot at the end?
I presume that we'll do them chapter by chapter. Is that?
That is what you did last time,
Yeah.
and then there is a group, just an overall recommendation as well.
Yeah. So I just want to start with the newspaper report this morning, because I think just to set a little bit of context for what we are doing here today, and I've got no problems with the article itself. The problem is the headline, and it often is. The person who writes the article doesn't write the headline. That the sub-editor's job is to attract people's attention to the story. And you have to capture that in even less characters than a tweet. So you don't have a lot of space to send a message that draws people's attention to the story. So thousands of homes at risk is a compelling headline. You'd want to read that story, wouldn't you? The thing is that thousands of homes are not at immediate risk. We're talking about a time frame that spans 50 years and spans 100 years based on predictions in relation to sea level rise. And that is what we are required to do by law as a council. We're required to look at our coastline, we're required to make these assessments, and we're required to put in place rules for development in those areas that will be exposed to risk in the future. So it is a very good, it's a legal requirement for us to do this. In Christchurch, we're faced with the situation where we are doing what would normally be done over a 10-year period in a very truncated time frame. This is good for the city overall. Overall, to have a district plan completely rewritten in 3 years is good, because I recall dealing with one component, one plan change under the previous arrangements, and it was, of course, the flood management areas, previously known as, and now known as the floor level and fill management areas. I've actually finally worked it out. But that took over 5 years from the beginning of the process to what was variation 48, plan change 48. It took from 2004 in its inception, 2005 in the notification, through to 2010 to be ready to be operationalised. It was operationalised on the 31st of January 2011, just 3 weeks before the devastating earthquake. That changed our landform forever. So to take advantage of what we've been offered in terms of having an opportunity to change our entire district plan in this time frame, I think it's a very good opportunity for the city. But it does mean that we're having to address hugely challenging issues at a time when the very communities that are affected by this are hugely challenged themselves. Challenged with decisions around rebuilds, around repairs, around floor levels, around fill management. All of these issues are affecting these areas. The one helpful element to throw into the mix in relation to the story this morning and the headline is that most of the homes, or a significant number of the homes that are going to be notified of the potential of the coastal hazard and in terms of coastal erosion and but in particular coastal inundation, are already in the floor level and fill management areas. They've already been notified that they are exposed to that risk, and this is just simply repeating the level of risk that they face. Coastal erosion is more challenging because we have an accreting beach, and so the concept of coastal erosion is hugely challenging for people in an environment where people understand that their beach has moved. But of course our coastline has moved over millennia, and that's a time frame that we're not having, fortunately, to deal with. But our coastline used to go back as far as Nancy's, I always called it, on the corner of Riccarton Road and immediately opposite Hagley Park. So the other side of Hagley Park used to be the coastline of Christchurch. It has gone backwards and forwards, but that is over millennia. As I say, the timeframes that we have to look at are 50 years and 100 years. Fortunately, we do not have to try and predict the future in that respect. But this is not our decision, because we have chosen to go down this pathway, which is that the independent hearings panel will decide this. We're not notifying this today. We're making a decision as to what is notified today. And then it is notified in 4 weeks' time. And at that time, it will go to the independent hearings panel. So people will make submissions on what we notify today. It is the independent hearings panel that will hear those submissions, and they will make the decision. So, lobbying councillors, putting, sort of pressure on the organisation, it's not helpful and it's not useful. What is really useful is that people understand what is actually, what we've based our decisions on, and what the independent hearings panel will be looking for. And we are here to assist our communities make those submissions. So on Thursday next week, we will begin with a series at the Hub. So at the Eastgate Centre, I haven't got the exact time, but we'll have the times online. At the Hub, that's the beginning of a series of community engagements over the next 4 weeks before it is notified on July the 25th. We've talked to community boards, we've talked to community leaders. That started last night, and what we heard last night was that people wanted to work out their own ways of engaging with the council, and so that it could help a meaningful submission process. And so we're inviting communities that are affected to let us know what it is that they would want from us by way of support in order to help them with submissions, but also to help them understand what the chapter that we're notifying says. The other thing is that we have made it available online for people to be able to search their individual properties. So people will be able to go online, they can do that now. The trouble is that the newspaper did kind of preempt that, and we didn't quite have it online before 8:30 this morning, but it is online now. So anyone who's already gone online to check their property and they want to, and they couldn't get on there before 8:30 this morning, people can get on there now, and it's all up and running, available for people to do. It's at www.ccc.govt.nz /coastal hazards. Thank goodness I had that in front of me. That was a very good interjection. Thank you very much. So I hope that sets a bit of a framework and a tone for today. And thank you very much for agreeing to come and present to us. But today is an opportunity for us to have something online that people can reference and that can help them get through what is going to be clearly a challenging time, obviously, for many who are in these areas who haven't thought of themselves as being susceptible to a risk. But I repeat the fact that the risk is not an immediate risk. It's not an immediate threat. But if we don't look at the risks at this time going forward, then we're going to be setting up a future council for some pretty hard decisions that could be avoided by mitigation and by adaptation and the different approaches that we have available to us. So on that note, I will hand over to you and ask for the presentation. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. As you've noted, Christchurch is a low-lying coastal city and the coastline has moved in past times. And residents who live close to the coast are well aware of this. They understand their natural environment and understand the potential for storm events to both disrupt their lives and damage properties. So the Council's undertaken a series of studies into coastal hazards over the past few years. The first one in 1999 was undertaken by Tonkin and Taylor. The second was released in 2013, and this third, more detailed study was specifically commissioned to support the proposed mapping of coastal hazards in the district plan. So just to have a look at what's in place already, Environment Canterbury have 2 coastal hazard zones in place, and they show the landward limit of the active beach system, so where you have both accretion and erosion processes operating and that coastline moves in and out. And that's over a 50-year period and then over a 100-year period. There's new data available to support this sort of mapping. There are new scientific methods to model and predict the outcome, and there are new statutory considerations. So that's why we are updating this work. So new coastal hazards assessment work looks primarily at 2 coastal hazards, that's coastal erosion and coastal inundation. And the district plan also maps the tsunami risk. That's mapped looking at the maximum probable event, which is a distant source tsunami, and we'll look at a little more of that later. But the Tonkin and Taylor report itself simply addresses the coastal erosion and coastal inundation. Now, the coastal inundation, which is flooding from the sea, is mapped in terms of a 1 in 50 event and a 1 in 100 year event. The coastal erosion, we're looking at what will unfold over the next 50 years and over the next 100 years. So the inundation work, there are 2 models used for the inundation. There's the simple bathtub model, which is used for the open coast and the areas around Ocurro and Littleton, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a simple water level model and predicts how far up the beach system and up along the coast the water will come with sea level rise over the next 50 and 100 years and in storm events. But within the estuary, we're using a dynamic model, which is named two-flow, and that's simply because the bathtub model would overestimate the flooding in the estuary and up the lower reaches of the Avon and the Heathcote if we use that one. Now, just before we get into the detail of the report, we'll just take a small diversion into the numbers. And we often talk about 50-year events, which is a return period for a flood. And scientists will also use the annual exceedance probability. So that's the likelihood of a flood. So a 50-year event, there is a 2% likelihood of that event in any 1 year. If you look out 10 years, there's an 18% likelihood of that event in any 10 years. And if we go out to 70 years, and you might own a property for 70 years, then pretty sure you'll get one of those. There's a 76% likelihood of one of those events over that time period. So what we need to remember when we talk about this is that these are random events and we're talking about probabilities. So it's nothing to do with regularity and predictable timetables. The study areas have focused on coastal hazards where we have settlements and where we have key road links. So that's why these study areas were chosen. So the open coast from the Waimakariri south down along the Spit and the settlements around Ocurro Harbour and Littleton Harbour. So those are all mapped and up online. Now, while we've always had coastal hazards, we're now faced with an increasing threat from global climate change and particularly sea level rise. So this work has used the latest science to plan for sea level rise of up to 0.4 of a metre over the next 50 years and up to 1 metre over the next 100 years. Now that is drawn from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and their 5th assessment. Obviously we'll continue to monitor what these predictions are and update this work in any future studies. Now, as noted before, the National Policy Guidance through the Coastal Policy Statement directs us to plan for at least 100 years into the future. So that's why we've looked at these 50 and 100 year periods. So going to coastal inundation, this is a simplified version of the diagram that you'll see in the Tonkin and Taylor report. And it just looks at the mechanism of flooding from the sea. So coastal inundation is caused by a combination of factors. A storm event comes with a low pressure system and that low pressure system effectively lifts the level of the sea. On top of that, you get the effect of waves driving onto the coast. And if you get all of that on a high tide, you get these quite significant storm events. And there's a photograph there of New Brighton back in July. And you may remember the recent examples of the storm damage in Wellington over the past few weeks. That's looking north from the pier. So there's a number of detailed maps in the report, and you've got them displayed on boards around the room, and these are all up online. This one's the inundation mapping for Ocurro. Now remember, this is event-based and incorporates progressive sea level rise. So the light blue shows the reach of the water in a 50-year storm with 0.4 metres of sea level rise incorporated, and the darker blue shows the 100-year event with 1 metre sea level rise incorporated. Now you need to remember that while this is mapped over the terrain and looks as though it's over the top of those buildings there, the maps show the extent of the flooding and don't indicate the depth. So the flooding is generally deeper, closer to the coast, and shallower on that higher ground inland. This one is in the lower Heathcote Valley and indicates the pattern of flooding around the Ferrymead area. And you'll see that flooding tipped back towards the city through Linwood there. And that's quite a different pattern of flooding than we would have seen prior to the earthquakes. So the earthquakes have changed the patterns of flooding across the city. And in some places where we've got half a metre or 1 metre of subsidence, we've effectively had our 50 years or 100 years of sea level rise just through a year of earthquakes. So to coastal erosion. Now the concept of shoreline retreat as the sea level rises is relatively simple. As the water level comes up, the line of mean high water springs or the reach of the high tide migrates inland. So that one's relatively simple, and that's the sort of model that's used around the Ocurro and Littleton coasts. But on the open coast, where we've got a plentiful supply of sediments, there's a number of different processes at work. So it's quite complex, a very dynamic environment, and so there are quite sophisticated models that have been built to predict the likely behaviour of this coastline over time. If you look at the model, If you look at the model, you'll see on the far right-hand side there's an arrow coming out that's showing that long-term accretion. So that's showing the supply of sediments and the fact that that coastline is constantly moving out and expanding the beach and the dune system. That's interrupted by periodic storm events where you get those short-term erosion which can take 5, 10, even 15 metres of beach and sand dune away in one event. At present, and for the next 50 years or so, the models tell us that that beach will continue to accrete. So the supply of sediment will keep pace with those periodic erosion events. But somewhere between 50 and 100 years or beyond, that'll turn, and the retreat due to sea level rise will start to overtake that long-term accretion effect. Now, this is just an example of the data that's gone into this, and apologies, it's a little hard to see on that dark background, but it's showing the monitoring results for the dune at Hood Street in New Brighton, and the trend over time is for that dune to move out and the beach to accrete, but you can see that interruption by periodic storm events where you get a rapid regression of that coastline, and then you get a build-up, and then again you get a storm event that takes it out.
So sorry, when it goes below the line, that's the storm event.
So when it gets a drop, so when the line starts to go down, that's a storm event, and then you get that rise as it builds up again, and then you get the drop, and then the line shows the overall trend, which is accreting.
Yeah.
How did you...
No. Sorry, I was just simply asking for a description of what was in front of us. I don't want... We'll leave questions to the end. So coming to the maps, the issue of coastal erosion is well illustrated along the spit, where you have got the modelling on both sides. So on the open coast side, you'll see the coastal erosion zones, which are in the light green for the 50-year period and the dark green for the 100-year period, are very narrow. So what they're doing there is essentially mapping the active beach, where we've got those systems of those processes of erosion and accretion operating. But on the estuary side, you can see the much wider zones where you're getting the line of mean high water springs and where the high tide reaches, progressively coming further inland over that 50-year and then that 100-year period. Going to an example out on Banks Peninsula, this one is Purau, and you'll note again you've got the light green, which is the area within which we expect the shoreline to retreat over the next 50 years, and the darker green over which it could retreat over the next 100 years. You'll also note that there's no mapping on either side of that soft sandy beach area, and that's because the majority of the shoreline around both Ocurro and Littleton harbours are hard cliffs, and there's no erosion expected there. In terms of the number of properties that are affected, these numbers, as you've said, are all online this morning. So within Coastal Erosion Zone 1, we have a little over 2,300 properties, and Coastal Erosion 2, a little over 4,500 properties. Now, the mathematicians amongst you will be doing mental arithmetic, I know, and adding Coastal Erosion 1 and Coastal Erosion 2 and finding it doesn't equal the sum at the bottom. And that's because, of course, there are a number of properties along the border. So there are a number of properties which have a little bit of Coastal Erosion Zone 1 and a little bit of Coastal Erosion Zone 2, and of course they're counted in each of those, but only counted once in the total. Now, similarly for the coastal inundation zones, we've got a little over 10,000 and almost 13,000 properties in those zones 1 and 2, and 17,000 all up. Now, as was noted before, those 17,000 properties, over 95% of those properties are already mapped within the floor level and fill management areas, so the flood hazard there is well known.
and it's a combination of the pluvial and tidal flooding drivers that we've talked about before, from the rivers, from rainfall events, and from the sea. The additional properties are largely because we've now mapped these inundation zones out on Banks Peninsula, so those Banks Peninsula settlements will now have the floor level and fill type controls. Looking at tsunami, now this is the mapping of what is predicted to happen if we get a magnitude 9 earthquake over in South America, and whether that arrives on a low tide or a high tide makes a big difference to the impact on our coast. So on the right hand side we've got a map where that deep dark red is showing where water is more than 2.5 metres deep, and that's the tsunami arriving on the high tide. Now this is mapped for information purposes in the district plan, but our response is primarily a civil defence response. So there are warning systems in place and evacuation procedures that would be undertaken. Now we're taking this presentation out to communities, and as noted we had a session last night with community board chairs and community leaders, and we've put together some brochures which give a plain language explanation of the work that's been undertaken. All of this will be available online. We've got a series of public presentations during July, and as well as the district plan drop-in sessions. And of course that property search function is up and running on the website this morning, and I did test it, it is working.
Yeah.
There we are, it's being tested around the room. Now, while this report was primarily commissioned to support the provisions in the replacement district plan, the information is of course being used by a number of units across council, and no doubt by other councils. So it will feed into the natural hazard strategy work that is part of both 100 Resilient Cities and the natural hazard strategy being developed in cooperation with Environment Canterbury and our neighbouring councils. Canterbury University and the Canterbury District Health Board, of course, are also involved in these initiatives. The council's also responding to the threat of climate change and sea level rise in the development of its infrastructure program. For example, moving water supply wells inland if we get saltwater intrusion into the aquifers, the installation of pressure and vacuum sewer systems, and looking at coastal roads and where the routes for those and any defences that are needed. It's also worth noting that there are options for managing both river and tidal flood threats. Now these will inevitably be a mix of taking care of our natural defences, particularly the dune system along the open coast, making room for our rivers, and that may indeed relate to future use of the residential red zone for the lower reaches of the Avon that are particularly susceptible to tidal flooding, and then looking at hard engineering options. We're also, of course, working with Wellington. So climate change and sea level rise is not only a problem for Christchurch, it's a threat faced by a number of towns and cities around New Zealand and worldwide. So there's already been correspondence between the Mayor and the Minister for the Environment on the need for better national policy guidance on responding to the challenges of climate change. And we've also worked with the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's team that is investigating the vulnerability of coastal communities and potential adaptation responses. So we expect that report to come out later this year. In terms of the district plan review, I don't want to get into the detail of that, except to say that there is a two-tiered approach to coastal hazard management, as we've had in the past. So we're retaining that two-tiered approach with the 50-year hazard zones and the 100-year hazard zones, with the more restrictive rules for the high-risk areas. And as noted, that tsunami mapping is provided in the plan. So I'm happy to take questions.
Right, Ali.
Quick one on the jetty. That shot of the water, the inundation of the Governor's Bay jetty, what event caused that?
That was a tsunami event. It was quite a large one.
From South America? Yeah,
Right.
that's about mid-tide, mid to low tide. So it doesn't show the worst possible case that you could get. But it was,
Right. So what was the date on it?
2010.
10, right, thanks.
Phil.
Ocurro one, was it? Sorry.
And the height of the surge at that, when the tide was midway, Peter, what was the height of the surge, sort of from the tsunami?
It was about half a metre, I think, the
Half a
surge
metre.
on our coast. Yeah.
Glenn?
Thank you. My understanding is the recommended sand dune height is it's either 7 or 8 metres from Ecan. Is that your understanding? 8 metres above the datum.
About mean high water springs.
Okay.
Yeah, Phil?
Thank you for the clear presentation, and those wee booklets will be good for us as councillors too, of course. But I just wanted to ask you about sort of one of the turning points you referred to, where around the dunes, where you said the accretion will turn between 50 and after 50 and 100 year time span. Could you sort of just elaborate a wee bit more on that, because it just seems to me that is a crucial point to plan for.
Yes, and it comes back to the probabilities and the random events. So,
Do you want to go back to that slide? Because I think that's, I don't know. Oh, excellent.
the one of the dune?
Yeah, because I think that's an area that, you know, that it's challenging for a lot of people because of the accretion. No, go forward. I think the picture is better.
That one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the thing to remember here is that these are models and predictions, and there's a famous old physical chemist, Niels Bohr, who said predictions are difficult, especially about the future. and that is true. So what we're dealing with here is random physical events, and we cannot predict with any certainty exactly where and when the coast will be, you know, at any particular point. So these models around the open coast, what we've used for the 50-year prediction is a probabilistic model. So we've got a 66% likelihood that the coastline, that there will be the coastal erosion zone in a 50-year period, and then for the 100-year event, we've looked at the potential erosion. So we've gone to a 5% likelihood for that. But I'll hand over to Dr. Ian Wright, to talk more about the processes at work, because he's a coastal scientist and will be able to give you a better understanding.